Good morning again, everybody, and good morning to those of you who are streaming with us. Today we have a really fantastic opportunity to get to know about Jesus. We all want to know Jesus, and we also get to know a lot about Peter. We also get to know a lot about the unseen divine being that we call God. And to kind of graft ourselves into the story here, this is the beginning of chapter 5 in Luke's Gospel. Jesus has been baptized on the Jordan. He's driven into the Judean hills, up into the brownness of all that for the 40 days. He comes down and he heads up to Galilee. He goes to his hometown. He tells them who he is. They want to kill him. He walks through without ceasing, right? That gaze right through them, and goes to Capernaum. And in Capernaum, which is where he makes his headquarters for the so-called Galilean ministry, he adopts Peter's family and is adopted by them, and he lives in the household of Peter. And we see the first day of his ministry where he preaches in the synagogue. Those of you who've been on the Holy Land pilgrimage, you know where that is. Comes over to Peter's house. Peter's mother-in-law is sick with a fever. He drives the fever out. She gets up, goes to serve him as the first disciple. And then that evening, they bring all these people to the doorstep. These are little houses with little rooms, and they're just a nest of little rooms. And they bring him. They can't get in the house. And Jesus in the doorway, and they bring him, and he heals people into the night. And then, but in the pre-dawn, he gets up and he goes off into the hillside, the beautiful, beautiful verdant hillside outside, off the edge of the Sea of Galilee, and he prays, and they track him down, and they say, okay, come back, we like you, we like what you offer. And he says, no, my calling is to go. And so he goes and he preaches the word throughout Galilee. And now we're back to our story. And it begins, it says once, it's the first word, which is to say, okay, now we don't exactly know the timeline, but Jesus has been about his business for a while, and we get Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, Lake Gennesaret, as it's known in Luke. And if you follow the story, Jesus is so, his light in his life, he's so captivating that people are pushing in on them. So you get this thing as the gospel goes forward. The crowds are pushing in on him and pushing and pushing and pushing. And so he often would, on the sea line, to just get into the boat and to get some distance. And he gets into Peter's boat. The Sea of Galilee is 13 miles long, it's 7 miles across. At the center, it's 148 feet deep. But in the early going, it's super gradual. And the waters, by our standards, are quite warm. And it's likely that Peter is standing, maybe hip deep in the water or something, holding the boat. Jesus sits down in the boat. Remember, in antiquity, the preacher always sits. The teacher always sits. And so Jesus sits down and he teaches them. And as he teaches them, he then says to Peter, head out to the deep. And as happens, you see all cultures all around the world, they have these types of netting that need to be cleaned. And Peter's crew, Peter and Andrew, clearly in business, partners with James and John, the sons of Zebedee. These are pretty well-to-do guys because they have this fishing business. And he says, out we go out into the deep. Now, the story at this point really takes on two levels, the level of reality and then a spiritual level. And we often think that that's how John's gospel works. It's always working on two levels in John's gospel, but we miss the boat, so to speak, if we don't see that happening here also. So when Jesus says, put out into the deep, what he's talking about is, go out where in the daytime the fish go into the middle and they're farther down. But what is also saying to Peter, which is go out into the deeper place in your consciousness. So this is a spiritual question of let's get off the shoreline. And in the shoreline, everybody's pressing on you. It's daily life. It's pound, pound, pound. And to go out in the deep is to go out into the silence and the stillness of the sea. And as they do that, he says, let down your nets, which is what we do in so-called meditation. What's the difference between meditation and contemplation? Meditation is what we do. That's our sending our boat out, dropping down the nets. That is what we might want to call contemplation. What God does is what contemplation does. Meditation is what we do. He sends out, down go the nets, and you get this net bursting with fish to the point of breaking the net. Now on the spiritual level, that's what happens in Peter's deeper consciousness, that he has this experience that is breaking Peter's mental net. And so this story is often known as the miraculous catch of fish and the call of Peter. But, it's not like Peter is getting a new job here. What Peter gets is a new life. And this is Peter's awakening, his conversion, and his epiphany of sorts. He already knows Jesus. Jesus has been hanging out in his house. But something happens in a place of deeper consciousness, and that's what we're going to take a look at here, because his consciousness is opened by going out. Now, the same thing happens to us. Our consciousness also opens up to the depths, and it can happen slowly by, just spiritual disciplines through time, spiritual attentive, being attentive to the life of the Spirit, and at some point you seem to drop down into some sort of awakening or conversion or deeper experience of the divine dimension. Or it can happen instantly, which is, St. Paul on the road to Damascus, some of which Paul is sort of touching on the reading that Mark just did. And so what happens here for Peter when the net is pulled up and he turns to look at Jesus is he has an encounter with the being of Jesus. Not just Jesus the man, he has an encounter with the holiness of Jesus, who Jesus is in the inside. And his encounter is just like in the Hebrew Scriptures, and in fact in many other stories of people who have an encounter with the divine. He has this experience of God. That's the thing that's happening here, is he's experiencing the man Jesus as the man God. And we might say at Christmas, God becomes man, and Epiphany, we see that this man is God. And that's what happens in this moment. And he has this strange and profound reaction to the inside of the who-ness of Jesus. And this is a reaction that is written just beautifully about in a book that was published in 1923 called The Idea of the Holy. It was a German theologian named Rudolf Otto. And in the chapter called The Holy as a Category, he uses two biblical examples. One is this one with St. Peter, and the other is what Margot read, is the call of Isaiah. These are the two examples that he talks about. And what Rudolf Otto is talking about is what we see Peter experiencing here. So the first thing is what he calls the mysterium, which is the mystery of the divine being. It's a mystery. It's beyond our categories, beyond our ability to talk about it. All the words we use are like Dixie cups at the Niagara Falls. They are just too little. They can't hold the divine being. And he's talking about people who come in touch with this, and perhaps you've had this happen in your life, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. That there's two reactions. And one of the reactions is what he calls the mysterium tremendum, sometimes translated as fear, but that it doesn't get at what's happening here. Better, we might say, is overwhelmed. That he has this spontaneous reaction. This is not a reaction where I've given this some thought. He has this spontaneous reaction, and it says he goes down to Jesus' knees. Don't you love the particularity of that? And so much of our biblical story probably comes from Peter, because the story, the Gospel of Mark, is really Peter's story told by Mark, which then gets embedded in Luke's Gospel. So Peter's basically saying, I went down to his knees and I said, go away from me. A phenomenal statement. Go away from me. And then he says, for I'm a sinful man. Go away. And this repelling is not unlike Isaiah, who that's an unbelievable reading. Isaiah is caught up in a vision of the temple, the divine temple. So the Jerusalem temple and the heavenly temple, and he's caught up, and he sees God, and he says, "Woe is me, woe is me." And then he says, "I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell among a people of unclean lips." In other words, Isaiah is saying, not just me, my whole tribe. We all don't have it. And so the cool thing that's happening here is that he's not talking about sin, like I did some stuff that was wrong and it's on the negative side of the ledger here. I got to do some good stuff to kind of counterbalance it. That's not what he's talking about here. This is an ontological question. Ontological meaning the study of being. So Peter, as a human being, comes in touch with the being of God, what God is really like. And he has this reaction, which everybody has, which is, Rudolf Otto, translated into English, has this great phrase, a definite depreciation, a, quote, disvaluation, that's a funny word, disvaluation of the self with respect to reality and existence. In other words, me as a human being, you as the divine being, I am nothing. That's the conclusion. It's the conclusion across the board for people who have these experiences. I am nothing. And the world I live in is nothing. And it points toward what we can all say where we are headed when we die and enter more deeply into the divine dimension, is we finally see who we are in light of who the divine being we call God is. And this divine being is so beyond, so full of what we might call light, life, and love, that there is no category, as I said. And so it blows the doors off. It's not like we're little or weak or dependent. It is like we are nothing. And that Evelyn Underhill, a great mystic scholar, Anglican, who knew Dean Robert, she would be a saint if we were Roman Catholics. She would say this begins the process of unselfing. All of this stuff I have built up is so self-centered, and we're so tribally centered. We think this is truth, but who we think we are, who we think we, belong to, this is nothing when compared to the divine being, which is everything and more. And that this reaction has within it also this mysterious fascination, this attraction, which at the same point not only says, woe is me, and is repelling, is like a magnet, boom, because once you experience it, that's the only thing you want. It's literally the only thing you want. It's the only thing you want because it's the only time you knew who you were, it's the only time you knew who everybody else in the world is, and they are your bosom friends. It's the only time you know that everything belongs. It's the only time you know there is no dualism. It's all unity. It's all peace. The peace of God which passes all understanding. That's what Paul calls it. It is this experience of life that is so full of experience of life that it catapults you with love. You are catapulted in love. You will love things irrationally because the life you've touched is irrational. And that the rational doesn't hold it at all. Doesn't hold it all. It's a Dixie cup in which we put our little selves and our little feelings and our little everything into. But in light of the divine being, there is this explosive desire to love and to serve and to live. That's what it is. And it's beyond. Take a look at St. Francis of Assisi. He exploded out of a totally dysfunctional life and became the great lover of all. And that's what happens to Peter. The call to Peter is this whole new life. And it says here in Mark chapter 10, 32, they were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way. The disciples were astonished, and those who followed were also afraid. In other words, this whole thing, this push and pull thing, it just remains. And Peter gives his whole life. It says he left everything. And it's like, well, wait a minute. What do you mean he left everything? What about his wife? What about his kids? What about his boats? What about his business? What that is trying to say is, once you've tasted the divine, you leave everything. It doesn't mean you leave your family or leave your job. It means you leave all the things that you think are true, and you follow the way of life, which is Jesus, because in Jesus is God.